Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Susan Hawthorne, and I'm the convener of the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, COAL. So welcome everybody to this final CSW session, Lesbians Are Resisting in Australasia Too, brought to you by COAL. The Coalition of Activist Lesbians respectfully acknowledges the Indigenous peoples of Australia and Aotearoa, land which has never been ceded, and their custodianship of the waterways, seas, and lands. We also acknowledge the many women throughout history who have fought for women's freedom and the freedom of lesbians, often at the cost of their lives. Today, you will hear in this order the following speakers. Sand Hall will speak about the history of coal, including photos from Beijing in 1995, where coal played a significant role. Susan Hawthorne, that's me, will speak about extreme violence against lesbians, including corrective rape, torture, and murder. Please be aware that it includes some difficult material. Jan Rivers from Lesbian Action for Visibility Aotearoa, LAVA, will speak about the court case against LAVA and the legal position of lesbians in New Zealand, Aotearoa. Anna Kerr from the Feminist Legal Clinic in Sydney will speak about lesbians and lesbian organisations which have faced legal cases in Australia and their resistance. These attacks and cases affect the freedom of women, especially lesbians, to meet in their own spaces. So our first speaker today is Sand Hall. Sand joined COAL in 1994. Was part of the Australian Lesbian delegation that received government funding to help delegates attend the Beijing. Originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Sand is a long-time community development worker. In recent years, she curated and published a trilogy of books with stories and photos from 50 years of women's lands in Australia, and I highly recommend them to you. We will each introduce one another. So, Sand, over to you.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you, Susan. Much appreciated. Yes, thank you, Susan. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here. The Australian government's involvement in the Fourth United Nations World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995 included funding the NGO organisation CAPOW, the Coalition of Australian Participating Organisations of Women, to coordinate 67 national women's organisations to have input into the Beijing Platform for Action. One of those organisations was COAL. Eileen Pitaway, here on the left, was involved with a refugee women's organisation preparing for Beijing and attended Asia-Pacific regional meetings. She soon realised that there was a resistance to the involvement of lesbians as part of Beijing. And in 1993, Eileen, along with a couple of her friends, here Barbara Palmer, third on the left, and Marg Merlin, fifth on the left, established the Coalition of Activist Lesbians Australia. They then applied for and were successful in gaining UN ECOSOC accreditation. We received government funding to prepare and attend the Beijing NGO Forum and Conference. So meetings took place, networking happened around the country, newsletters and position papers about lesbian health, domestic violence, violence against lesbians, and lesbian families and the law were written. Then off to Beijing we went with boxes of resources to share. There was a lesbian tent created as part of the NGO Forum in Huaro on the outskirts of Beijing. This was the first time there was official lesbian space in China and in United Nations territory. I was part of the coordinating group of the tent, one of the representatives from the Asia Pacific region. Malu from the Philippines, here in the white singlet, was our other rep. The others were representing Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Europe and North America. The tent was well attended by lesbians from around the world, and workshops were a big part of the activities there. African lesbians met daily at 1 o'clock. And here, Australian singer-songwriter Judy Small runs a workshop about lesbian music. Australian lesbians were active and visible, as were representatives from various North American lesbian, gay and bisexual groups. The information table answered inquiries and let women know what was happening. There was a lot of media interest in the lesbian tent from international media. We had a media training workshop with input from women from the International Lesbian Information Service, the Lesbian and Gay Task Force, the Ms. Foundation for Women, and the Media Watchdog Group. Collectively, lesbians at the tent created this statement, signed by women from 47 countries, calling for the conference to recognise the freedom of women to determine one's own sexual orientation as part of the platform for action. Our issues related to our safety as lesbian and bisexual women and the human right of everyone to freedom of association, which is Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Carmen Lawrence visited the lesbian tent. She was Australia's Minister for Women and Health and our senior representative at the conference. Eileen Pittaway and Barbara Palmer represented Australian lesbians at the conference. And due to the high interest from international media, we allowed the press to be present at some of our information sessions. Given the safety concerns of many lesbians, media were told they could not film half of the tent. They could only film women in one half of the tent. Here, Bev Ditzi from Soweto, South Africa was speaking. Bev was a long-time activist, having helped organise the first Pride March in Africa in 1990. She was later instrumental in enabling the inclusion of sexual orientation in the new Constitution of South Africa. Here, Julie Dorff from the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission answers questions. Julie has also continued to be an activist to this day. It rained a lot at the forum. It was very muddy. Lesbians at the tent organised a coming out around the world action, a lesbian human rights march, even though marches were discouraged at the forum. We paraded throughout the areas of the forum, and lesbian rights, human rights, was our key message at both the forum and the conference. This is Gabby from Australia. Lesbians from around the world brought banners. And on the left here is South African Bev Ditzi again. Bev attended and spoke at the conference. In her speech, she said, "If the World Conference on Women is to address the concerns of all women, it must similarly recognise that discrimination based on sexual orientation is a violation of basic human rights." Today, Bev is still a lesbian activist as well as a filmmaker. Here, Philippa O'Keefe, Barbara Palmer and myself from Cole were in the march and enjoying the atmosphere. Our march was large and well attended. Over the 30 years since this march, the word sex has been conflated with the word gender. This has done significant damage to the safety of women, girls, and lesbians around the world. Sex is a biological reality. Gender is a personal and social identity construction. that now enables men to claim to be women and access women's spaces. Lesbians are women-loving women. During these 30 years since Beijing, many Australian lesbians events have been forced underground for fear of legal consequences if we do not allow men saying they are lesbians into lesbian spaces. This is having a devastating effect on many young and emerging lesbians. They have been cut off from us older ones who have been forced underground, and they are being encouraged to become transgender, take puberty blockers, testosterone, and have mastectomies. It is largely the queer and transgender movements influencing young and emerging lesbians and influencing these changes. This is affecting all spaces designated as safe for women, girls, and lesbians. Spaces that used to be free from male influence and abuse in any form. I see this as space invasion, akin to colonisation. As part of the NGO Forum, we join delegates in other Australian women's NGOs and around the world for a photo shoot on the Great Wall of China. COL continues to be active. We are involved with CSW and CEDAW. Delegates have attended meetings and we have provided reports to Beijing +5 and Beijing +10. We have testified at the International Women's Human Rights Court, as well as participating in other processes. And since Beijing, the global situation for many lesbians has become dangerous. After the publicity from the Lesbian Tent, the Forum and the conference, some countries like Nigeria and Sri Lanka created legislation criminalising lesbian relationships. And in just the last 3 years, 64 countries have criminalised consensual same-sex attraction. Penalties include imprisonment, flogging, and/or death. COL continues to fight for the human rights of lesbians. Along with compassion and a focus on the spirit of humanity, we maintain the rage. Thank you.
I think I jump in now. I'd just like to thank Sand for sharing those beautiful photos from Beijing. Really amazing and such an important legacy that we need to preserve. And now I'm going to introduce Susan, who is a writer, researcher, publisher, occasional academic, and the convener of the Coalition of Activist Lesbians. She joined the Women's Liberation Movement in 1973 and for several years was a volunteer at Melbourne's Rape Crisis Centre. She's been doing research on lesbians who have been tortured and lesbian refugees since 2003. And she's the author and editor of 30 books and just a wonderful woman. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Anna. My talk today is called Asking Questions About Lesbians. So today I'm speaking to you from Juru country in far north Queensland, where I live and work, and I respectfully acknowledge their custodianship of the land's waterways. I also acknowledge the many women throughout history who have fought for women's freedom and the freedom of lesbians, often at the cost of their lives. I'm beginning my talk today with some quotations from lesbians who've been subjected to violence, including corrective rape, torture, forced pregnancy and forced marriage, imprisonment, and the ultimate punishment, murder. I honour all these lesbians for their strength, for their resistance, and for their love for lesbians, and I raise questions on behalf of them and all lesbians. So the research that this is based on is what I've been doing since 2003, and you can read more about it in Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, and also I book from last year, Lesbian Politics, Culture, Existence, which is a whole stack of essays written over 50 years. So now to the words of lesbians. In Sierra Leone, On 29 September 2004, Fanny Ann Eddy was found dead after being repeatedly raped. She had testified at the UN Commission on Human Rights in 2004, just a few months before her death. She wrote, "Silence creates vulnerability. You, members of the Commission on Human Rights, can break the silence. You can acknowledge that we exist throughout Africa and on every continent, and that human rights violations based on sexual orientation or gender identity are committed every day. You can help us combat those violations and achieve our full rights and freedoms in every society, including my beloved Sierra Leone." She had been working in the offices of the Sierra Leone Lesbian and Gay Association, which she founded, on the day that she was murdered. My questions are, what action was taken by the UN Commission of Human Rights then, and what action is being taken now? Human rights commissions seem to have a very bad record. I ask, would we try to be horrified about what has happened to lesbians? In 1976, under the Pinochet regime in Chile, Consuelo Rivera Fuentes was tortured and later fled to England as a refugee. She writes in a co-authored piece with her partner in 2001, she writes this: "No training session prepared me for this intense pain, my pain, the one I did not choose. All this alienation, this empty vacuum, my body, my mind, my pain. This is not happening. I am a little speck in the universe. Which universe? The world is not anymore. I am disintegrating, bit by bit, yell by yell, electrode by electrode. The pain, all this pain here and there, down there in my vagina, the agony. Where am I? Where is my I?" Consuelo asks, where is my I after her experience of torture? She is also asking, where is my lesbian I? Where is the centrality of the experiences of lesbians recorded and recognised? Where is the recognition that the violation of lesbians goes on day after day and no one speaks of it? An unnamed lesbian refugee from Iran says of her experience, in Kashan, they tied me to a car and pulled me across the ground. What should I say? Who should I say it to? Why doesn't anyone listen to us? Where is this human rights? An unnamed Peruvian lesbian says, when I speak of my right to my own culture and language as an Indigenous woman, everyone agrees to my self-determination. But when I speak of my other identity, my lesbian identity, my right to love, to determine my own sexuality, no one wants to listen. In Zimbabwe, in the mid-1980s, Tina Machida says, they locked me in a room and brought him every day to rape me, so I would fall pregnant and force me to marry him. They did this to me until I was pregnant. In my book Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, I also document the murders of lesbians in South Africa, yet sexual orientation is a protected characteristic in the South African Constitution, as well as murders of lesbians in the US, including the murders of 2 lesbians and their son by transgender advocate Dana Rivers in 2016. So what are the elements that go together to make it so difficult to have successful campaigns on behalf of lesbians? So this is a list of features that I've noticed. When colonisers conquer a land, their first reports back to empire usually contain something along the lines of, the natives possess no culture. They excuse themselves for conquering and dispossessing others. In the same way, Lesbians are said to have no culture. The denial of lesbian existence, which is a way of breaking the spirit. The destruction of lesbian knowledge and culture. Heterosexuality is imposed. Isolation, a particular problem for young lesbians, lesbians with a disability, and old lesbians. There's also the criminalisation of lesbians, punishment, including the death penalty, long imprisonment, and torture, including rape, and humiliating sexual violence, and things like being pushed off the top of buildings till their death. Murder, honour killings, and persistent rape, so the lesbian becomes pregnant against her will, and corrective rape by gangs of young men, prison guards, and families. Treatment as second-class citizens, direct or indirect discrimination. Government failure to recognise lesbians in law as a distinct group subjected to discrimination. Inferior medical services, such as partners not recognised as next of kin. If a lesbian manages to bring a case against the perpetrator, there is a high chance she'll be forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement. This results in the crime being made invisible as a crime against a lesbian, and in that way, it doesn't exist. Lesbians are shamed and expected to be either heterosexual or, if not, to transition and appear as masculine. Shame creates isolation. Ostracism can result in bullying, taunts, and beatings. It creates what Indian writer Maya Sharma calls a discourse of catastrophe. Lesbians are also declared mad. Lesbians who resist publicly are attacked both online and in real life. If a lesbian becomes famous, she'll be remembered either for her sexuality, in which case her achievements remain hidden, or her sexuality will be hidden and her achievements remembered. These are the result of shame and make documenting lesbian history very difficult. Reading through that, it makes me realise it's amazing we keep going. Is it any wonder then that lesbian refugees have to travel such a hard path gaining refugee status? In 1987, 11 years after she'd been released from prison and Chile was apparently now under democratic rule, a trap was set for Consuelo Rivera Fuentes, who I talked about earlier. A policeman came to her workplace at the British Commissariat and told her she should come to police headquarters with him after convincing her she had nothing to fear. He took her through the building where she had been tortured and into a room where an officer sat at a table. The officer wanted her to have sex with his female lover. Consuelo realised this was a trap and she agreed to meet him in 2 weeks. Consuelo left Chile 5 days later. She had already planned to fly to the UK and was enrolled in a women's studies course there. It just shows how important women's studies is, and they would do the water. Nigerian activist Aderonke Apata was not so lucky. It took her 13 years to gain asylum in the UK. One of the sticking points, according to Theresa May, who headed the Home Office at the time, was that Aderonke was pretending to be a lesbian to gain asylum. She was put in solitary confinement for a week in Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre in 2012. The accusation of pretense was because she was the mother of a child, and the assumption was, therefore, she must be heterosexual. As we know, there are many lesbians who are mothers, some who married because this was a temporary protection for them. Likewise, if a lesbian does not have a current female partner, the question is raised, is she really a lesbian? A lesbian without a female partner slips to the default position of heterosexual. In the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, lesbians are put in Block 13, which is reserved for LGBT people, a group that is not necessarily safe for lesbians. Lesbians are routinely abused and suffer persecution within the camp. This resembles what happens to lesbians who are in prison. Christine, a Ugandan lesbian, was not only tortured by the guards, but raped by other prisoners. So when we come to Australia, a lesbian refugee wanting to gain asylum in Australia faces a difficult path. There are an enormous number of hurdles, among them endless documentation of the abuse and trauma a lesbian has suffered at the hands of family, community, religious groups, police and government. Some governments do not have an arm's length distance between those assessing the claims for refugee status and those enforcing the criminal laws against lesbians. The result is that lesbian claimants are vulnerable to punishment in the country from which they are attempting to escape. With a drawn-out bureaucratic system in the country to which she wants to move, her very existence is under constant threat. The legal costs of engaging an immigration lawyer are substantial, thousands of dollars, and each applicant needs letters of support that confirm the importance of this applicant's need for asylum. The word lesbian is not mentioned once by the Australian government in its recent 9th periodic report to CBIL of January 2025. If the meaningless word gender identity is used, how can lesbians with a woman-to-woman sexual orientation be protected under law or gain entry into Australia when seeking asylum as lesbian refugees? Members of the Coalition of Black Activist Lesbians, that's COLE, a tiny unfunded organisation, are currently engaged in trying to assist 2 lesbians wanting asylum in Australia. We are told that the waiting period is likely 6 years before a decision is made. Guidelines for officials interviewing lesbian refugees. Some women might be persecuted because of their association with or under threat, but if they're lesbians, their level of risk may be increased. It should not be assumed that a married woman cannot be a lesbian. In some countries, marriage is the first level of protection a lesbian might seek. Lesbians seeking asylum are likely to be politically active, but even lesbians who are not politically active come under threat in some countries. Do not assume that because a woman does not use the word lesbian to describe herself, that she is not a lesbian. It may have been too dangerous for too long for her to be able to speak the word lesbian or the equivalent in her language out loud. Or the word may be so insulting in her own language that she does not want to use it. Do not assume that because there is no word for lesbian in any particular language, that there are therefore no lesbians in that society or linguistic group. Do not assume that if a woman comes from a country where it's not illegal to be a lesbian, that she is therefore not able to claim having been tortured or in danger of torture or other external harm to herself. Do not assume that your interpreter is open to her experience. The interpreter may be hostile to her claim. Lesbians who've been tortured will find it difficult to speak of their experience. Speaking to a stranger is difficult. Speaking to a strange man might be impossible. Uniformed men may precipitate reliving the experience of torture. As a result of torture, some lesbians may be unable to relate the experience at all, or might appear detached and emotionless. This should not be read as evidence of fabrication. Lesbians who are refugees might also be in danger from their families, in particular from the men in her families. Her confidential interview should not be shared by asking questions about her sexual orientation of other family members. So, in conclusion, if violence against lesbians is a matter of indifference and lesbians remain outside the scope of social justice reform, then everyone's civil and political rights remain in jeopardy. The most difficult political reforms to make are, in the long run, the most important because they give us a clue as to the limits of our preparedness to live an ethical existence. If we are unable to be concerned for the lives and well-being of those who are most different, then we're incapable of defending justice for all, even at the most basic level, that involving freedom of association and freedom to love. I would suggest that when lesbians become victims of attack, they are a signal. They are the canaries in the mine. And if the perpetrators get away with it, then other attacks will follow. So we need to be protesting every attack on lesbians because this is a sign of hatred in the social system. If lesbians are not protected, then people who don't fit some other social dimension will not be safe from attack either. Keep your lesbian sister safe and watch the effect it has on society. And these are all the various references that I've referred to in my talk. And finally, I'd like to thank everybody in the Coalition of Activist Lesbians for their responses and suggestions to this presentation. And that includes Vivian Morrigan and Deborah Staines and Barbara Clark, who all had suggestions. And my other co-presenters at last week's session, Sandhall and Jan Rivers of Lava and Anna of Feminist Legal Clinic. And I'd also like to say thank you to Consuelo Rivera Fuentes for friendship and to lesbians facing the bureaucratic hurdles of seeking asylum. Sadly, Consuelo died a few years back. Thanks to lesbians around the world who continue to resist the horrors of violence and to fight for those whose lives have been directly affected by violence. So thank you, everybody, for coming today.
It's my pleasure to introduce Jan Rivers. Jan is a former public servant based in New Zealand and is a member of Lesbian Action for Visibility in Aotearoa. Realising that lesbians and women were under pressure, she has looked at the ways that the New Zealand public sector has disadvantaged lesbians, young and old. She is also the New Zealand spokesperson for GenSpect, whose focus is non-medicalised approaches to gender distress. Welcome, Jan.
Welcome, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming along to listen to these talks today. I'll just share my screen, and I'll get going. So, LAVA is Lesbian Action for Visibility in Aotearoa. I should say kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to this talk from New Zealand. LAVA is a lesbian group based predominantly in Aotearoa, New Zealand's capital, Wellington. Founded in 1988, following legislation that decriminalised male homosexuality in New Zealand, it was created in the anticipation of the possibility of a law that would bring human rights protections to lesbian and gay people. So our history precedes the 1995 Beijing conference by a few years, but is largely contemporaneous with it. Most of my presentation is a single country study of the political and policy fortunes of lesbian women in New Zealand, which in large measure is a study of the policy making and advice given by our Human Rights Commission and the way that that's proliferated across government. But first I will discuss LAVA's history and achievements and our policy and legal situation, then our policy and legal situation, and then finally the detail of a legal case that we're pursuing, which has come about largely in part because of the policy changes that have happened. Even before our founding, lesbian women who became LAVA were involved in work on the decriminalisation of male same-sex relationships, We campaigned to have the word lesbian included in the Human Rights Act of 1993. That was the first country in the world. Although interestingly, the protections for lesbian and gay people are reciprocal rights. There's also a right not to be discriminated against on the basis of sexual orientation, whether it's same-sex or bisexual or heterosexual. In 1994, at the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, noted lesbian academic Nahuya Te Awakuku attended the commemoration from New Zealand wearing this lava t-shirt very much like this, and she spoke in front of the 1.25 million people there. There are links to the history which I can share later. So, like in many other places, the trajectory of lesbian visibility has been one of almost complete invisibility, and then throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, notoriety by a few brave women, as well as the building of an invisible community. From the 1980s to the mid-2000s, we might regard as a golden age of acceptability. But from 2006 onwards, in New Zealand at least, there has been a history of incursions. So these are the policy issues that are of concern to LAVA. Almost all of them have been implemented or are the responsibility of our Human Rights Commission. And there are a couple of others, including in 2018, unbeknownst to anyone, because it wasn't announced by a policy announcement or any policy work, the Ministry for Women changed or created a definition of women to be trans inclusive. I'll go through most of these topics in order to kind of explain to you the way that incursion on our rights has happened. But our position as a result of this is that lesbians are same-sex attracted, not same-gender attracted. Young lesbians are facing pressure to transition because of their gender non-conformity. Lesbians want to enjoy women-only services and lesbian spaces, as well as being included in the diverse rainbow community's decision-making. And that New Zealand's Human Rights Act supposedly protects lesbians, while our Human Rights Commission has been undermining them. There's lots of impacts on this, and I'll speak to them briefly, but all of these things have been the experience of people of lesbians in New Zealand. We've lost friendships, our institutions have crumbled, our community is divided, there have been differences of view and cancellations. Our dedicated funds have generally and largely been repurposed to other organisations. Young lesbians in particular have been threatened with violence, they've been shamed, their events have been cancelled, and there's been a huge pressure to describe themselves rather than lesbian as queer, and they've not been supported when violence occurs from within our lesbian community. So once again, lesbians are becoming invisible in New Zealand, and these as I mentioned, these protections began to be undermined in the mid 2000s, and the main real concern here is the way that the New Zealand government has adopted the Yogyakarta principles. And this is really ironic because the Yogyakarta principles are intended to be a framework for the international protection of lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, transgender, queer communities. But it's the unintended consequences of these changes that have had an impact. And I'll just provide something of a brief description. The Yogyakarta Principles were signed in 2006 by a number of human rights lawyers. The figurehead of the Yogyakarta was the former Irish president, Mary Robertson, who from 1990 to 97 was the the president of Ireland, followed by a period as the chief human rights commissioner. Her impeccable record was a liberal reformer who legalized homosexuality in Ireland and abortion, made contraception legal, and legalized the possibility of divorce. So, but Yogyakarta has never become a United Nations Convention. Its premise was that human rights instruments detail obligations to ensure that people are protected from discrimination and stereotypes, but that the people who claim sexual orientation and gender identity, their rights have been fragmented and inconsistent internationally. Founded by ARC International, a Canadian NGO, the Yogyakarta Principles had an unusual approach to assessing new jurisprudence. Any law or case law anywhere in the world was adopted that was favourable to sexual orientation, gender minority and intersex communities was included. This, of course, is quite unlike a human rights convention, which is made by international, what's internationally agreeable to many countries. When I make these comments, I'm not being transphobic. I'm making comments about the well-being of lesbians and the unintended consequences of work intended to protect them. Our recent Human Rights Commissioner, Paul Hunt, was one of the original signatories. One of the original authors, though, and the convener of the Yogyakarta project, Michael O'Flaherty, who is now the head of the European Commissioner for Human Rights, assessed at the time that the principles are inconsistent with women's rights, saying they came at the price of the invisibility in the text of any reference to the particular situation and issues of women, and of course, lesbians as well. Another author, law professor Robert Wintermuter, later disassociated himself with them for the same reason. He said, "We just didn't think about women at all." But the Human Rights Commission in New Zealand has assessed the Yogyakarta Principles wrongly, as if it were a binding United Nations convention. Last year, our Human Rights Commission wrote wrote exactly that, and said that the Commission's definition of sexual orientation as being same gender attraction rather than same sex attraction is based on the definition contained within the Yogyakarta Principles. These principles have been used widely across New Zealand government because of the powerful influence of our Human Rights Commission. They've been used to redefine sexual orientation across government as the basis for our self-identification, condition-free self-identification legislation, in the collection of statistics which now prioritize gender over sex, and they've been used in a way that make them binding on government. So I'll just briefly talk now about a Crown Law opinion which took place in 2006. Again, the same year as just about the same time that the Yogyakarta Principles were signed off. A New Zealand MP, Georgina Beyer, was one of the world's, I think, the world's first transgender MP. She proposed a private member's bill which would include gender identity under the Human Rights Act. But it came fast on the heels of some anti-smacking legislation in New Zealand, and the Labour government felt that they'd used up their social capital and they wanted a reason to withdraw the bill that would have introduced gender identity protection into the Human Rights Act. So what they did instead was to withdraw the bill and to ask the Crown Law, which is the part of our government that advises the government on the nature of legislation, to provide a legal opinion. The Crown Law found that there was no reason to believe that transgender people can't be protected under the sex-based rights of the Human Rights Act. And of course, it was important for compassionate consideration, for example, for the right to marriage and to access a partner's superannuation. Almost all the cases that the Crown Law Department relied on in assessing trans people assess them as the sex that they are and not the gender that they say they are. But our Human Rights Commission has interpreted the law instead to assess transgender people as their assigned gender, putting them into direct conflict with women's rights, with lesbians' rights, and with those of gay men. The Crown Law opinion there are some questions around the quality of it, in that it doesn't necessarily address all of the legislation that addressed the needs of transgender people prior to 2006. And in particular, one case, the case of Bellinger versus Bellinger, pertinent cases weren't even cited. For example, that UK case said specifically, the criteria for recognizing self-perceived gender in one context, such as marriage, may not be appropriate in another, such as competitive sport. So whereas the legal opinion was indicated that there might be limits to these rights, our Human Rights Commission decided that there were no such, has decided basically that no such rights, and where rights are conflicted, it appears that they believe that the rights of trans women over women and lesbians takes precedence. I'll go on now to the next slide, which is about a report from the Human Rights Commission, which took place in 2008, and it was called To Be Who I Am. And it was a report on the discrimination against transgender people. And it was very good, and it had many, many good recommendations. But one of the real problems was that it used information from transgender adults with a memory of their childhood, of their gender discomfort. And therefore, they made the assumption that children with gender issues become transgender adults. They ignored the research that shows that between 60 and 90% of prepubescent children who have gender dysphoria or gender discomfort resolve it by the end of puberty, and the majority who desist become gay or lesbian as adults. No non-transgender adults were consulted about their childhood gender feelings. It's a typical policy problem. It's about the way that poor data collection can lead to unintended consequences. But as I hope you can imagine, the impact of deciding that children with gender distress are transgender adults in the making can hardly be overstated. Later, in 2020, the Human Rights Commission created a report, which the intention of which was to be a roadmap in the aftermath of the election of a progressive, very progressive Labour and Greens government in 2018. That report said that gay people are same gender attracted, contrary to the human rights law that they administer. They claimed that everyone has a gender identity. They claimed that compared with same-sex attracted people, transgender people have greater vulnerabilities and have had fewer of their needs met. And of course, they quoted the Yogyakarta Principles as if they were binding law. But I've done some research about this claim that transgender people are uniquely vulnerable, and I've used the 2012 report into a big survey of people from the north half of the North Island in New Zealand, something like 6,000 or 8,000 young people. And it showed that irrespective of the type of harm, young same-sex attracted people are equally, if not more vulnerable than those who claim to be transgender. And what's more, there are between 8 and 10 times more young same-sex attracted people. I've just completed the work on the subsequent Youth 19 researchers came out in 2022, and they didn't actually compare the circumstances of gay and lesbian young adults with transgender young adults. But when I've combined the data, it shows that while both groups are more vulnerable than the norm, on each measure where trans and young people are more vulnerable, same-sex attracted young people are also more vulnerable. And that's with the usual statistical standard of a 95% confidence interval. So not only is our Human Rights Commission deciding that that gay and lesbian people are less vulnerable, even though that's happening, young lesbians are being transitioned. The 5 young women who have documented their detransition are all now young lesbian adult women. Their detransition stories are complex and they're heartbreaking. And the way that when they change their minds about their identity, they are abandoned by their community is particularly cruel. And the other factor that wasn't, again, considered by our Human Rights Commission is that when this is the data from the GIDS, the Tavistock Clinic in the UK, and what it found was that the majority of female transitioners are same-sex attracted, as are more than 40% of the male transitioners. And obviously from these statistics, we can show that many of them are also have been bullied and have poor mental health. So the people who are being transitioned often, and the Tavistock Clinic found this, and we believe that this is exactly the same in New Zealand, that young people are not being asked about their same-sex attraction when they are making a decision to transition. And in fact, one of the pieces of legislation that's been introduced into New Zealand is an Anti-Conversion Practices Act that states that no action taken to help a child or young person, to help someone with their transition, is ever a conversion practice. And the dangers of that should be fairly obvious. The final thing which I'd like to talk about before I talk about our case is the stance that has been taken by Oranga Tamariki. So Oranga Tamariki is New Zealand's children's ministry. It provides care homes and fostering and advice about the well-being of children. It produced a report in 2003, and it did a literature review on the needs of the supposed rainbow community. And there's an interesting feature of the way that lesbians are included in the lesbian community at the moment. The word takatapui is an historical word that means important, significant friend of the same sex, and it was recovered from the early Maori by Nahuia, who I mentioned earlier. But that word has been adopted and commandeered by the broader rainbow community and taken to mean LGBTQIA for Maori people as a synonym for the word rainbow, which means LGBTQIA for European and other communities. But the most significant thing about this report that was made by Oranga Tamariki about how children in care should be cared for was that it, although there are depending on the statistics, between 4 and 10 times more same-sex attracted kids, the research only interviewed 8 out of 9 of the children that they interviewed were children with gender issues. So they interviewed these children, and so lesbian women and young gay same-sex attracted men in care were completely ignored by this report and by the subsequent policy, which argues that anyone with who shows any gender issues needs to be sent very rapidly towards both social affirmation and medical affirmation of their gender, and the dangers to young traumatized gay and lesbian people who may well have issues of body disassociation because of their trauma. That's often why they're in care, because they've been very poorly treated, should be quite obvious. My next topic, and finally, this is to talk about the map, the lesbian banning from Wellington Pride's annual event out in the city. It's a time when the lesbian LGBTQIA community takes over our town hall with stalls and music and goodness knows what. In 2021, we made a map of Wellington's history, and the idea was that it would be informative and interesting to the attendees. Shortly after we had registered, and shortly after we were discovered that our registration had been not accepted, and we were called TERFs by the members of Wellington Pride, who refused to explain to us why we had been cancelled from their event. As a result of that, we're now involved in a legislative, in a legal battle to be for their decision to be found to have been against our human rights law, again under the provisions of sex and of political belief. It's a huge case, and although the part of the human rights apparatus that decides whether to support interesting and cases that clarify legal opinion, that part of the Human Rights Commission decided that there was no case to answer. So we're having to fund our own expenses for the case. Wellington Pride, interestingly, has invited 19 expert witnesses to testify at the case against us, which of course has made our costs. We anticipated that they would be about $180,000 to $100,000, and that was before we knew about these 19 expert witnesses. So we have had to find expert witnesses to counter each of the points that they have made, and that means that we're facing large costs. The case is due to take place over 4 weeks between July and October 2025, and we have an active fundraising effort, which we would be very pleased if people attending here would be willing to share with their colleagues, friends, and fellow lesbians. Thank you very much. I'll now introduce Anna. Anna Kerr is a founder and principal solicitor of the Feminist Legal Clinic Incorporated, which is an Australian community legal service focused on advancing the sex-based rights of women and girls. In 2023, the Feminist Legal Clinic was granted special consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations.
Thanks, Jan. So Feminist Legal Clinic is an unfunded community legal service in Sydney, Australia. And much of our work has involved domestic violence advocacy, as well as cases involving discrimination law. The City of Sydney Council originally supported our work and provided us with a free office space and a grant to launch the service. But that was until we, a few years later, hosted an event featuring lesbian speakers, including one woman who had detransitioned, who is not pictured for reasons of, her privacy. But we have a few of the other speakers pictured here. And this next photo is of the protesters who stormed the auditorium and snatched the microphone from our speakers. And the sign in his hand actually reads homophobes, I won't say it, F off, which is ironic considering they were directing their protest against a group dominated by lesbian women. So shortly following the event, we were contacted by the staff of the City of Sydney Council, who were concerned about our activity for the women's sex-based rights movement and asked that we desist that, and that news reports posted on our website that might offend the trans community should be removed. So when we failed to comply with those demands, our tenancy was eventually terminated. So this cartoon by Stella Perrott, which I hope you can all see, it's kind of obscured on my screen, but I hope you can see it. This was given as an example of the content we had on our website that was cited as a reason for terminating our tenancy. So I include it today, hopefully Stella won't mind, because it's relevant really to some of the cases that we've had to deal with and I'm going to discuss, but also because I've been asked to make this funny, which it is funny if you have a very dark sense of humour. Anyhow, despite this setback, Feminist Legal Clinic has continued its work, and one of the groups we've represented has been the Lesbian Action group, who are indeed fighting back in Australia. There is currently a federal court appeal by the Lesbian Action group against the Australian Human Rights Commission. The Lesbian Action group originally requested an exemption from the Sex Discrimination Act so that they could exclude men and heterosexual women from their events. However, it was determined that while it would be acceptable for them to exclude heterosexual women and males generally, no exemption could be granted for them to exclude those males who identify as trans women, as that would offend the gender identity protections in the Act. That decision was appealed, but the Administrative Review Tribunal upheld the decision of the Commission, and so now the case is on appeal again now to the Federal Court. So I won't talk in any more detail about that case, particularly before it is before a court, but watch this space. But this is not the first effort by women to challenge gender identity ideology. Even before the Lesbian Action Group case, there have been earlier cases, including that of Jessica Hoyle, who brought a claim against the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commissioner. Actually, this was similar to the Lesbian Action Group in that she originally sought an exemption to exclude all males, including those claiming to be women, from a lesbian event that she planned to hold in Launceston, Tasmania. Again, Jessica was unsuccessful at first instance and took the matter on appeal to the Tasmanian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, where she was again unsuccessful. The tribunal upheld the Commissioner's decision not to grant the exemption. So Jessica, of course, was very keen to take this all the way through the court system, and we were providing pro bono assistance. But unfortunately, she didn't have the necessary backing because once you go to the court system, appeals through the court system always carry a risk of large cost orders against you should you be unsuccessful. So that's a limitation. So unfortunately, many women keen to bring these activist cases commence them without having sought legal advice beforehand, probably because it's quite difficult to get legal advice on these matters. As a result, they bring them in their own name rather than establishing an appropriate incorporated body, which they should do because they need to do that if there's any expectation of litigation to ensure that they are not exposed to personal liability, because should they own any property whatsoever, they could lose it through the litigation. So one thing, it's important to be fighting back, but it's also important to be prepared and equipped to last the distance. Equipped means not only having the necessary funding to cover disbursements, which, like filing fees, can in themselves be considerable. Also, they'll need legal representation, ideally a pro bono team, because the expenses are so high. And I was interested to hear about what Jan says about that litigation happening in New Zealand, and wonder how they're managing to fund the costs of such litigation. Well done if they can do that. And of course, there are some cases, of course, the Giggle and Tickle case happening at the moment. They've managed to crowdfund a large amount, but not everybody, unfortunately, seems to be able to reach the sort of numbers of people to raise that sort of funding. It's also important to have had advice about incorporation, as I mentioned, and also advice about the legal prospects of the particular case, because running ill-advised cases is not necessarily the best way to secure law reform. Although admittedly, the accompanying publicity is very important, I think, in raising the public awareness of the problem. However, it's worth keeping in mind that those promoting gender identity ideology have been very strategic in the cases that they have brought, and no doubt that reflects the fact that they have access to very high level legal advice and campaign strategists. So, of course, a lot of these cases are not planned, but are thrust upon lesbian women. So, for example, Jessica Hoyle was shopping in a department store wearing her LGB Tasmania hat and shirt and having a pleasant conversation with another shopper who recognised her and shared her concerns, when a member of the Target staff overheard the conversation and asked Jessica to leave the store, basically for being a TERF. So that brings us to the second Jessica Hoyle case. And this was clearly a case of discrimination against her in the provision of goods and services. But the Commissioner didn't see it that way, and the tribunal also determined that being a TERF is not a political opinion or activity. So unfortunately, Jessica again was not equipped to take the matter further, which is a great pity. Excuse me. So this demonstrates how flimsy the discrimination protections really are, since clearly not only do they prioritise the rights of people who identify as trans over the rights of lesbians and women generally, but they also protect only those political opinions and activities which have the approval of the Commissioner. And this is frankly worse than useless. And they're clearly not familiar with this famous quote, which, by the way, it's routinely attributed to Voltaire, but apparently was actually it's a quote from his female biographer, Evelyn Beatrice Hall, who summarised his position with these words. It's sad that a female biographer is only famous. She had to write under a male pseudonym, and of course she is not known in her own right because no one probably wrote her biography. It seems sad that she is only remembered for having memorialised a man. But anyhow, I digress. Back to the problem, which is that also we see in a lot of employment matters that the whistleblower protections fail because those administering those protections choose not to recognise as whistleblowers those who attempt to expose the promotion of fraudulent and harmful gender identity ideology. So we've tried to access the whistleblower protections because we have quite a lot of women contacting us because they want to speak out in their workplace to protest, whether it's the toilet system or whether it's just we've had social workers who concerned about care and protection aspects of these policies, and we've had teachers, we've had, you name it, academics, across the full range. We've had people who want to speak out in their workplaces, but if they do, they put their employment at risk. And unfortunately, most of them have left the union movement because the unions are so thoroughly captured. And so we have this difficulty for them that if they do speak out and lose their employment, they've also got no one to then represent them in the ensuing employment, the unfair dismissal case. And so we have a real problem there. And I've tried in trying to help these women, I've tried to see whether we can't use these whistleblower protections, but not with much success. Because of the attitude that they don't extend to protecting women who want to speak out on this. But look, freedom of speech and freedom of association are not the only casualties of gender identity ideology. They're also the lives of the countless young women and girls that are being harmed by the fraudulent sex change industry. So in 2022, I can speak about this matter, which has been in the media. Jay Langadinas commenced medical negligence proceedings in Sydney against her doctors for the harm that she suffered as a result of masculinizing hormones and also undergoing a mastectomy and hysterectomy. Look, there are many other young women in similar distressing circumstances, but there remain many barriers to litigation. I've got a picture here of Mel Jeffries and Lee Hazel, who are rare amongst detransitioners, for want of a better word. So, of course, there's no such thing as transition, but we know what that means. But they're rare in that they're in their willingness to speak publicly about their experiences, because there are many psychological hurdles as well as legal hurdles to overcome before litigation is possible. And in terms of the legal hurdles, of course, we've also got the difficulty of locating lawyers and doctors willing to put their own professional reputations at risk by running these cases. So this fear people have of speaking out is throughout the entire society, extends to the judiciary as well, that we're aware that the judges themselves are fearful about making decisions which will then result in a lot of pushback against them personally. There's also a big need to lift time limits on these types of cases, just as they've had to lift the time limits that relate to child sexual abuse cases. There's a need. These cases have also got similar difficulties because of the psychological journey that it takes for a young woman to realise that she was a victim, even if she was actively wanting these interventions and pushing for these interventions. It takes a certain level of maturity to look back and not only to realise the mistake, but also to realise that they were a victim and that it is appropriate for them to bring a claim, because often they feel a bit complicit in what's happened, even though they were very young and vulnerable at the time. And often personal injury claims, it varies from state to state and there's various complexities to it, but it's often like 3 years from when you've determined that you've suffered an injury, become aware that you've suffered an injury. It can be as short as 3 years, which is just not long enough for a lot of these cases. Look, I just wanted to say also that just lesbians have been fighting this battle for a long time. These are cases that I'm familiar with in the decade that more than a decade now, that I've been aware of this whole issue and battle. But there were many earlier battles being fought before I had any awareness of it, and the other women here would know all about them. Some of the earlier battles fought have related to the Lesbian Space Project in Sydney, the cancellation of Lesfest, and the Sappho's Party case. I'm sure there's many more, and it's very important that we document this history of lesbian activism. There's also been countless submissions by lesbian women, and one of them is the one by, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrongly, Irini's Autonomous Activist Lesbians. They did a 15,000 word submission on this topic to the Australian Human Rights Commission back in 2010. It's a remarkable effort, and I think probably some of you know the women responsible for that, but it clearly fell on deaf ears. But nevertheless, it's very important that this history of fighting back by lesbian women is documented and that it's not allowed to be forgotten, because the erasure of this history allows a false narrative that the gender identity movement is a grassroots and progressive movement, which it clearly isn't. And it's not. And the idea is that it's only opposed by bigoted conservatives, which is clearly not what the case if you have a look through the history. Just quickly, I'm just mentioning a bit more detail here of the cancellation of Lesfest, which was as a result of a complaint brought by Sally Goldner. Sally Goldner, who's now who was a founder of Transgender Victoria, and she took the organisers of the Lesbian Festival 2004 to the Victorian Equal Opportunity Commission for advertising that the forthcoming festival was to be for lesbian-born female only. The women managed to get an exemption, but it was then later overturned. Faced with a threat of litigation, Lesfest 2004 was officially cancelled, and I believe there was a private party held. So this was one of the earlier cases where lesbian women were being driven underground. However, the good news is that fight still continues, because some of the same women who were involved in that earlier battle 2 decades ago are now bringing the current Lesbian Action Group case in the federal court. So we haven't given up. Women haven't given up. Lesbian women haven't given up, which is great to see. And we need to know to honour all these women who fight these battles, whether they win or lose. And I should mention quickly, not every battle has been lost. The case of Sappho's Party, the South Australian case, in that case, the lesbian women did ultimately win the case. But it also needs to be said that litigation does take a toll on those involved. It's very true that the legal process is itself a punishment, and it's almost always lengthier and more onerous than people expect. And I think there's no doubt that that's at least partly intentional by the legal system to deter the faint-hearted and certainly those who are not wealthy enough to fund litigation with ease. So despite all of these hurdles, lesbian women in Australia continue to fight on. Thank you.